Hey guys, welcome back to Daily Kaylee. This is the second episode of the 13 Days of Halloween series, and I'm ready to get fucking spooky. The last episode you heard was about the Richard Speck murders of 1966, which inspired parts of American Horror Story Season 1. Today's episode is about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, which inspired Season 2 of American Horror Story. Betty and Barney Hill are from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This entire series of events takes place on September 19th, 1961, one night and probably over the span of no more than 2 hours. It is extremely strange. And this is actually the very first major claim of an alien sighting in the United States. So, Barney Hill was born in 1922. At the time of this happening, he was about 39 years old. His wife, Betty, was born in 1919, and she was a social worker. She was obviously a few years older than Barney. They were an interracial couple. And this is important because at this time, that was extremely uncommon. They were actually members of the NAACP and huge community leaders. And Barney actually was on a local board for the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights. The Hills loved to travel. On the night of this happening, they were actually literally driving home from a vacation that they had taken to Niagara Falls. Now, on September 19th, 1961, it was around 10:30 p.m. They were just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire. Betty looks up into the sky, and she claimed to have seen a bright point of light in the sky that was moving out from below the moon and past the planet Jupiter up towards the west side of the moon. They were on U.S. Route 3. Barney was paying attention to how to navigate their way back home, so Betty was the only one that was paying attention to this at this time. In her head, she was like, okay, it's probably just a falling star, except it was moving upward. She continued looking, and finally, since it was moving just what seemed to be super randomly and getting bigger and brighter, Betty told Barney to stop the car so she could get a closer look and use the excuse that they could walk their dog as well. So Barney stopped at a picnic area south of Twin Mountain, which is also New Hampshire. Betty got out the binoculars, and apparently what she saw through these binoculars was an odd-shaped craft, which had flashing, multicolored lights, and it was traveling across the face of the moon. She had a sister, and years earlier, her sister had said that she'd seen a flying saucer. So, Betty just thought she could also be seeing one right now. When Barney looked through the binoculars, he just assumed it was an airplane traveling toward Vermont on its way to Canada. However, he pretty much immediately realized that was bullshit, because without even looking like it had turned around at all, suddenly this craft was rapidly descending towards Barney's direction. This is what caused him to realize, and I quote, "This object that was a plane was not a plane." They immediately returned to the car and kept driving south down the mountains. The stretch of mountains that they are traveling down is the Fransonian Notch, which is a major mountain pass in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. The main mountain here is Cannon Mountain. This is exactly where this abduction takes place. So keep that in mind. So Betty and Barney keep driving down the road. It's isolated. They are the only car on this road. It's 10:30 at night. There's just not much traffic, and they're in the middle of the mountains, so you can imagine. They stated that they were driving very slowly through the Fransonian Notch in order to observe the object because it kept coming closer. They claimed that at one point the object passed over a restaurant and a signal tower, which was on top of Cannon Mountain, and then came out on the opposite side. Betty says that it was at least 1.5 times the length of the profile of the cliff, which was about 40 feet long, and that apparently it seemed to be rotating. The couple sat in their car and watched as the craft moved silently and randomly back and forth in the sky. It almost looked like it was bouncing. It was still lit up with the multicolored lights. Extremely weird behavior. Still in the Franconia Notch, but 1 mile south of Indian Head. The object rapidly starts descending toward their vehicle, which caused Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. This huge, silent craft was hovering about 80 to 100 feet above their car. And it was so big that it filled their entire windshield. That's all they could see when they looked out. Barney stated that it reminded him of a huge pancake, just over their car. He put his pistol in his pocket and stepped away from the vehicle to move closer and get a better look, essentially. He still used the binoculars, and he claimed to have seen 8 to 11 humanoid figures who were looking out of the windows of the craft, which he thought they were looking at him. All at the exact same time, every single one, besides one figure, moved to what Barney thought appeared to be a panel on the rear wall of the hallway that was in the front portion of the craft. The one remaining figure continued to stare at Barney and somehow communicated a message to him, telling him to stay where he is and to keep looking. Whenever the news stories came out, Barney had a recollection of observing the humanoid forms wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. At this time, red lights that appeared to be on these bat wing fins began to come out of the sides of the craft. And a long structure, sort of like a bridge, descended from the bottom of the craft. The craft continued to approach Barney, and once it was about 50 to 80 feet ahead of him and 300 feet away from him, it stopped. He stated to investigators later that somehow he knew that they weren't human. Barney, ripped off the binoculars. He was like, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck, no. Runs back to the car. He's, in hysterics at this point, and he's telling Betty, they're gonna capture us, they're gonna capture us. He saw the object once again shift its location to directly above the vehicle, instantly. He drove away at extremely high speeds and told Betty to look for the object, make sure it wasn't following them. She rolled down the windows, looked up, but immediately they heard these rhythmic series of beeping or buzzing sounds, which they sounded like they were bouncing off the trunk of their vehicle. That's how close it was. The car was vibrating, and apparently a tingling sensation passed through both Betty and Barney's bodies. They said that right after this, they experienced the onset of an altered state of consciousness that left their minds feeling dull. They heard the beep and the buzzing again, and they returned to full consciousness. Within this time frame, they found that they had traveled nearly 35 miles south. But they only had super vague, spotty memories of this section of road at all. All they could recall was making a sudden turn that they had not planned on taking, encountering a roadblock, and then observing a fiery orb in the road. They finally arrived home around dawn, and they absolutely had some strange sensations and random impulses that they could not explain whatsoever. Betty insisted that they keep their luggage near the back door rather than in the main part of the house after just returning from a trip. Their watches would never work again. After this incident, they completely stopped working. Barney said that the leather strap on the binoculars was torn, but he could not recall it tearing or an instance of why it would have torn. The toes of his best dress shoes were scraped. And he also says that he was compelled to examine his genitals in the bathroom, though he found nothing unusual, so he has no idea why he felt that he should do this. After they got home, they took extremely long showers to remove any possible contamination, and they drew a picture of what they had observed. They were obviously extremely confused on their way home and said that tried to reconstruct the events chronologically as they were driving home. But they both agreed that immediately after they heard the buzzing sounds, their memories were incomplete and super broken. After sleeping it off for a few hours, Betty woke up and put the shoes and the clothing that she had worn during the drive into her closet. She noticed that the dress was torn at the hem, zipper, and the lining. Later, whenever she went to retrieve the items from her closet again, she noticed a pink powder on her dress. She hung the dress onto the clothesline, and the pink powder blew away, obviously, but she couldn't fix the dress. She decided to throw it away and then thought better of it, and decided maybe to hang on to it a little bit longer and hung it back in the closet. Over the years since 1961, when this happened, 5 different laboratories have conducted chemical and forensic analysis on the dress. On the trunk of their car, where they heard the beeping sounds coming from, there were these shiny circles on the trunk that had not been there the previous day. Betty and Barney experimented with a compass, and they noted that when they moved it closer to the circle spots on the trunk, the needle would just whirl rapidly. But when they moved it a few inches away from the spots, it would drop straight down. A couple days later, on September 21st, Betty decided to call the Air Force Base closest to their home to report the UFO encounter. She was super afraid of what people would think and what they would say about her, so she withheld some of the details. On September 22nd, Major Paul W. Henderson telephoned the Hills for a more detailed interview, pretty much. Henderson's report, which was dated on the 26th of September, determined that Betty and Barney had probably just misidentified the planet Jupiter. He changed his report 3 times later on, from optical condition to inversion, and then finally to insufficient data. His report was eventually forwarded to Project Blue Book, which is the U.S. Air Force's UFO research project. Within days of this encounter, Betty borrowed a UFO book from a local library. This book was written by the retired Marine Corps Major Donald E. Kehoe. He was also head of the NICAP, which was a civilian UFO research group. On September 26, Betty actually wrote a letter to Donald and told the full story, including the details that she had kept from the Air Force Base, which included the humanoid figures and the details that Barney had noticed about them. Betty wrote that she and Barney were also considering hypnosis to help recall what was happened. Her letter was passed on to Walter N. Webb, who was a Boston astronomer and also a member of the NICAP. Webb met with the Hills on October 21st, 1961, so a little over a month after it happened. They had a 6-hour interview, and the Hills pretty much told him everything they could remember from the encounter. Barney insisted that he had developed a mental block, and that he suspected there were some portions of the event that he did not want to remember. He described in detail all that he could remember about the craft and the appearance of the humanoid figures. Webb stated that they were telling the truth, and that the incident probably occurred exactly as they reported it, other than some minor uncertainties and technicalities, but that was to be expected. This is when it gets even weirder, if that's possible. 10 days after the UFO encounter, Betty began having a series of extremely vivid dreams, and they were very, very strange. They continued for 5 nights. She had never had dreams that she could remember so much detail from. But after 5 nights, they just stopped, and she never had them again. During the day, all she did was think about these dreams. She mentioned them to Barney, and he was sympathetic, like, oh, whatever. But he wasn't really concerned, so she just kind of dropped it and was like, whatever, it's probably nothing. In November, which was almost 2 months after these dreams began, she started writing down the details of her dream. In one of the dreams, she and Barney encountered a roadblock, and men surrounded their car. She lost consciousness, but struggled to regain it. She then realized she was being forced by 2 small men to walk in a forest in the night, and of seeing Barney walking behind her, but when she called to him, he seemed to be in a trance or maybe sleepwalking. The men were only about 5 feet or 5'4", and they wore matching blue uniforms with caps that were kind of similar to those worn by military cadets. They appeared almost human, except they had black hair, dark eyes, blue lips, and their skin was gray. She said their noses were also extremely prominent. In these dreams, Betty and Barney, along with the men, would walk up a ramp into a disc-shaped craft of metallic appearance. Once they were inside the craft, Barney and Betty were separated. She protested and was told by a man that she claimed to be the leader that if she and Barney were examined together, it would take much longer to conduct the exams. She and Barney were taken to separate rooms. Betty then dreamt of a new man, who was similar to the others, but he entered to conduct her exam with the leader. This new man she calls the examiner. He had a pleasant, calm manner. Apparently the leader and the examiner both spoke to her in English, but the examiner's command of the language seemed imperfect and she had difficulty understanding him. The examiner told Betty that he was conducting these tests to note the differences between humans and the occupants of the craft. He seated her on the chair and a bright light was shone on her. The man then cut off a lock of her hair, examined her eyes, ears, mouth, teeth, throat, and hands. He shaved off small trimmings from her fingernails, and after examining her legs and feet, he used a dull knife, which was almost like a letter opener, to scrape some of her skin onto what she thought resembled just a piece of cellophane. He then tested her nervous system, and he shoved a needle into her navel, which, according to Betty, was agonizing, and noticing she was in pain, the leader waved his hand in front of her eyes and the pain went away. The examiner left the room with his findings, and Betty then engages in conversation with the leader. Apparently, she picked up a book with rows of strange symbols that the leader said she could take home with her. She also asked where he came from, and he pulled down an instructional map dotted with stars. In Betty's dream, the men began to escort her and Barney away from the ship when a disagreement broke out. The leader then informed Betty that she couldn't keep the book, and stated that the other men had decided they did not want her to ever remember the encounter. Betty insisted that no matter what they did to her memory, she would one day recall what happened. They walked Betty and Barney back to their car, and the leader said that they need to wait and watch the craft leave before they leave. They did this and then resumed their drive. On November 25th, 1961, the Hills were interviewed again at length by more of the NICAP members. This time, the members included C.D. Jackson and Robert E. Homan. Or Homan. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to say Homan because it looks like the Hoh National Rainforest. Their drive home from their trip should have only taken about 4 hours. It was only 178 miles. But they arrived home 7 hours after their departure. And at first they claimed that they had not even realized that it took that long. Whenever Homan and Jackson noted this to the Hills and let them know that that is preposterous, it shouldn't have taken that long, the couple had no explanation. They have no idea what happened and where the time went. This is what they call a phenomenon of missing time, which is totally self-explainable. The Hills could recall almost nothing of the 35 miles between U.S. Route 3 and the Indian Head. Both of them still recalled the image of a fiery orb sitting on the ground, and Betty and Barney just assumed that it must have been the moon, but Homan and Jackson informed them that the moon had set earlier in the evening. Of course, the subject of hypnosis came up, and it was decided that it should be carried out to see if they could get back the memories. Barney was kind of skeptical, but he decided to do it because maybe it would help Betty just forget the nonsense of her dreams. By the following February, about 6 months later, the Hills were making frequent weekend drives to the White Mountains, hoping that revisiting the site would bring back the memories. They were entirely unsuccessful in trying to locate the site where they observed a fiery orb in the road. However, they did eliminate several possible routes, and they found what they claimed was the capture site on Labor Day weekend in 1965, finally. It wasn't until March 3rd, 1963, that the Hills first publicly discussed their UFO encounter, and it was just with a group at their church. From this group at their church, there was an amateur hypnotist who came to give a formal lecture. Of course, the Hills asked him to perform hypnosis on them. He said he could not feel comfortable doing it because he was, like I said, an amateur, but he recommended them to a psychiatrist named Mr. Stevens. This man by the name of Captain Sweat. He recommended that Barney ask him about the use of hypnosis for this case. When Barney next met with Dr. Stevens, he asked about hypnosis, and Dr. Stevens referred the Hills to Benjamin Simon, who lived in Boston. They first met with him on December 14th, 1963. Early on in their discussions, Dr. Simon determined that the UFO encounter was definitely causing Barney far more worry and anxiety than he was willing to admit. Apparently, Simon completely dismissed the alien hypothesis as being impossible, but it seemed obvious to him that the Hills genuinely thought that they had witnessed a UFO with humanoids. On January 4th, 1964, Dr. Simon began hypnotizing the Hills. He hypnotized Barney and Betty several times each, and these sessions lasted until June 6th, which was, about a span of 4 or 5 months. Dr. Simon also conducted these sessions separately so that they could not overhear one another's recollections and make up a story, basically. He wanted this to be genuine. At the end of each session, he reinstated amnesia so that they couldn't go home and discuss it either. So, Dr. Simon hypnotized Barney first. Like I said, he knew that this was causing him a bunch of anxiety and worry, and he wanted to know why. His first recollection of witnessing these non-human figures was very emotional. He had expressions of fear, emotional outburst, and just being amazed by what was going on. Barney said that due to his fear, he kept his eyes closed for most of the abduction and the physical examination. Based on these early responses, Simon told Barney that he would not remember the hypnosis sessions until he was certain he could remember them without being further traumatized. Under hypnosis, Barney also reported that the binocular strap had broken when he ran from the UFO back to his car. He recalled driving the car away from the UFO, but that afterwards he felt somehow irresistibly compelled to pull off of the road and drive into the woods. He eventually saw 6 men standing in the dirt road. Apparently the car stalled, and 3 of the men approached the car. They told Barney not to be afraid, but he was obviously still anxious. And that's when the leader told Barney to close his eyes. While he was hypnotized, Barney said, "I felt like their eyes had pushed into my eyes." Barney described the beings as being generally similar to Betty's hypnotic recollection. Apparently the beings often stared into his eyes, and when he said this, he seemed to be terrified, but at the same time extremely interested in these non-human beings. He was almost mesmerized by them, it sounded like. Under hypnosis, Barney would say things like, "Oh, those eyes, they're in my brain, they're there." And he would also say, "I was told to close my eyes because I saw 2 other eyes coming close to mine, and I felt like these eyes had been pushed into mine." In his 3rd hypnosis session, he said, "All I see are these eyes. I'm not even afraid that they're not connected to a body. They're just there. They're just up close to me, pressing against my eyes." Barney said that he and Betty were taken onto the craft, and that's when they were separated. He was escorted to a room by 3 of the men and told to lie on a small exam table. Unlike Betty, Barney's narrative of the exam was super undetailed, and he continued to keep his eyes closed for most of the exam, like he said. A cup-like device was placed over his genitals, and he thought that a sperm sample had been taken from him. The men also scraped off some of his skin, peered into his ears and his mouth, and A thin tube or cylinder was inserted into his anus and quickly removed. Someone felt his spine and seemed to be counting his vertebrae. Betty reported a conversation that she had with the leader that she also understood in English. But Barney said that he heard them speaking in a language that he did not understand, but he also heard them speak English. Betty also mentioned that a couple times that she heard them talk to each other, they were not speaking English. Barney said that when they communicated with him, he thought they were using telepathy, that they were not actually speaking out loud. Both Betty and Barney said that they did not see their mouths moving when they communicated in English with him, which kind of further pressed the point. Barney recalled being escorted from the ship and taken to his car. In a daze, he watched the ship leave. He remembers seeing a light appearing on the road, and he said, "Oh no, not again." This was the fiery orb, by the way. He also recounted Betty's speculation that, this light must be the moon, though the moon had set several hours earlier. He also stated that he attempted to reproduce the code-like buzzing sounds by pretty much driving from side to side and stopping and then restarting the vehicle, but he couldn't do it. He could not remake these noises at all. Now, in Betty's sessions, her account was very similar to her dreams, but there were also notable differences, which were mainly about the capture and the release. The technology on the craft was different. The men had a significantly different appearance than from her dreams. The sequence of events were also in a different order than they were in her dreams. However, Betty and Barney's memories, while under hypnosis, were very consistent. Betty was extremely emotional when she was recounting their capture and examination. He actually had to end one session early because tears were flowing down her cheeks and she appeared very distressed. Simon gave Betty a suggestion, post-hypnosis, by the way, she's coherent, that she should sketch a copy of the star map, the one that she believed that the leader showed her in her dream. She later described the map as actually being almost like a three-dimensional projection, sort of like a hologram. Eventually, she did what Simon suggested. The map had many stars, but she only drew the ones that stood out in her memory. Her map consisted of 12 prominent stars, connected by lines, and then 3 lesser ones that formed a triangle. She said that she was told the stars connected by solid lines formed trade routes, and the dashed lines were to less traveled stars. After these sessions, Dr. Simon speculated that Barney's recollection of the UFO encounter was possibly a fantasy inspired by Betty's dreams. Simon thought that was the most reasonable explanation. Barney, of course, rejected this idea. He thought that was total bullshit. He also noted that while their memories were consistent in some parts, there were also portions of their narratives that were very unique. Barney could not have made that up on his own. At this point, Barney was now willingly ready to accept that they had been abducted by fucking aliens, but he never embraced it as fully as Betty did. After the hypnosis sessions, they went back to their regular lives. They were willing to discuss the encounter with friends and family, and of course some researchers that would eventually pop up, but they made no effort to speak publicly about this. There's been tons of movies and books, interviews done. Barney died 8 years after the UFO encounter on February 25th, 1969, of a hemorrhage. Betty lived until October 17th, 2004, and at age 85, she had never remarried. Now, over the years, there have been so many people to study the star map that Betty drew. It has been picked apart more times than I can count. But there is one vantage point that completely matches Betty's map. It is the only one out of thousands that they have tested that match this map. And it's from the viewpoint of the double star system of the Zeta Reticuli. Now, if you don't know what the Zeta Reticuli is, I didn't either until I read this, so don't feel bad. It is only visible in certain parts of the world. Like, for example, you cannot see this from Great Britain. It is not visible whatsoever because of the latitude lines. But the Zeta Reticuli is a wide binary star system in the southern constellation of Reticulum. From the southern hemisphere, the pair can be seen with the naked eye as pretty much like a double star when it's very dark outside. This system is located about 39.3 light years from Earth. Both of these stars have characteristics that are similar to those of the Sun. And, I mean, this constellation matches her map perfectly. I don't know if you believe in aliens, but I believe in something. And I believe that Betty and Barney Hill were fucking abducted. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in a couple more days with episode 3. Thank you guys.